Hi everyone, George here, the producer of the Sales Transformation Podcast. This week's episode picks up right where last week's left off in Phil's discussion with Dr. Philip Styrlund and Dr. James Robertson from the Summit Group. So if you haven't listened to the first part of the conversation, please do go back and listen to that one first for the context. If you're already up to date, then there's nothing left for me to say except enjoy part 2.
Yes. So just to summarize, I think what you've begun to crystallize, I think, for us is that this dimension of the horizontal axis being traditionally, I think, where many organizations are kind of focused their sales enablement or sales performance improvement around competencies, behaviors, knowledge, and so on, in terms of helping people to become a more enhanced sales performer. But you've now identified this vertical dimension, which goes a lot deeper, where you start to talk about reflective practice, the cognitive skills. You're talking about people's values and belief systems, which I know is based on a little bit the research that I've done, but also this concept of character as well. Which is, I think, based on some of the work of Fred, Dr. Fred Kiel. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more this concept of character and values and beliefs and how they interplay with each other.
So Phil, let me unpack that. And first of all, you mentioned Dr. Fred Kiel, and I just want to go back to relationships. Fred passed away just as we were finishing our doctorate. Yeah. And that was lost on us because I would say Fred is probably one of the most influential relationships in my life. And in addition to the two of you, and I mean that sincerely, not just because we're on this podcast together, but my life is different as a result of Fred being in it. But his body of work was also staggering because for the first time, what he did is correlated character habits to business outcomes. And after 8 to 9 years of research, validated and published by Harvard, he correlated 4 specific character habits to number 1, financial outcomes, number 2, leadership, number 3, to employee and customer engagement. So in other words, what he showed is being of high character is good business. So in a nutshell, those 4 character habits after 9 years of research were the following. Number 1 are 2 of the head, 2 of the heart. The 2 of the head are number 1, integrity. Do what you say you will do when you say you will do it. It sounds very simplistic, but unfortunately in today's world, it distinguishes you wildly. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is responsibility, following through on what you say. But I also think there's another variant of response-ability, which is your ability to respond to things that we don't know. It's that mental agility and leadership agility. The other 2 habits were of the heart. The first one is a word that rarely is used in business, forgiveness. First is forgiveness of self. So we don't just become an accumulation of regret, because as humans, we all make mistakes. But the question is, have we learned from them, extracted the learning and wisdom from them, and then let go of them so we can live life forward? And also forgiveness of others. Now, this just doesn't mean that you just, if someone makes a mistake, you just immediately forget it. No, Fred goes into that deeper and says, you don't forget until A, they've acknowledged it, B, they've learned from it, and C, they've demonstrated that they've changed their behavior. So it's not just willy-nilly forgiving. And finally, the one that's correlated the most financial outcome, believe it or not, is the 4th habit, and that is compassion. To really treat others as human beings, not as job titles or functional widgets, but actual humans. Humans who have a past, a present, and a future, who just like you and I have hopes and dreams and fears. And what he found is that when you treat others with true compassion, authentic compassion, you really tap into an untapped reservoir of energy and intellectual power that people hold back. But when you treat them as humans, you're tapping into that reservoir. And so ironically, of the 4 habits, the one that was most correlated to business and financial outcomes was compassion. There's Fred's body of work in a few minutes. I hope I did it justice.
Phil, do you mind just repeating the four character habits? Because you mentioned the word character, but habits is really important. The word habits as well. But could you just, for the benefit of the listener, just remind us just what were the 4 again, so we can hold them in our head as we move on?
The core 4: 2 of the head, integrity and responsibility; 2 of the heart, forgiveness and compassion.
So if we take those 4 and then through the kind of reflections that you've had in terms of, these were very much leadership, I think, traits that Fred had done his research in, but your interest was in mapping those 4 character habits with the function of sales, or the function of sales leadership. How did you start to sort of unpick that or apply it to the sales area?
What we did is we showed that the vertical development of the future is taking those character habits as one building block, also talking about the cognitive capacity that we mentioned earlier as the second building block, and then the third building block of mindsets.
Yeah.
The core of that vertical vector now that we're speaking about, which we believe is part of bringing your whole self to both life and work. And also, it's where we see the smart companies now investing their training and development resources, not just on breadth building, but on depth building. By the way, we especially see this in healthcare. Why? Because character, trust matters deeply, especially in that industry, but not only in that industry.
Yeah.
James, comment on how you're seeing this either within or beyond healthcare.
Yeah, I think, if we go back to that eras of selling and how fundamentally the world of sales has shifted, is that the business of representing your products and services has been outsourced. There are configuration engines, value calculation engines, AI. That's doing the historical work, and I think we all know that, but that's doing the work of the traditional sales representative or sales professional of the past. What we're seeing now is that, and technology companies, some of our clients like Microsoft or Google, they'll refer to humans in the loop, and they say that the future is going to be the interdependence and leveraging the strengths of both technology and AI and people. So they refer to humans in the loop. And how we see that play out with our clients and in the world of sales is that company and organizational ecosystems are going to try to figure out, in this complex world, how do we solve problems worth solving and challenges worth exploring and addressing? And they're not going to be able to do that alone. So that's going to require collaboration, internal alignment and collaboration with customers. In essence, we put a word to that, and it's everyone has a different view of what it means, but it's about co-creation. And so it's a long way of saying you can't come together as an organization, as an ecosystem with other people, unless there's trust, unless there's compassion, unless there's the fundamental elements of mindset and character set and cognitive thinking. So that human in the loop, if that's the way that the sales role is going to be in an omni-channel AI-enabled world around co-creating, addressing major issues and challenges, fundamentally, we're going to have to be able to build that capacity, those mindsets, those character habits that Phil was referring to. In healthcare, we see it playing out. If I just give a couple of examples, if that's okay. For example, J&J Innovative Medicine, they're putting a lot of energy into health equity. I don't know how that plays out in other parts of the world, but in North America, there are huge disparities in outcomes of care based on access to care and social, what's called social determinants of health. It's a highly complex issue and challenge, and nobody's going to be able to solve that on their own. So J&J is investing with other health systems, with other organizations, and saying, how do we figure this out together? And that's got to be based on trust. It's got to be based on character. It's based on how you think. You're not going to solve that with more skills, more process, more knowledge, in a sense.
Just to punctuate this, Phil,
Yeah.
James and I had the pleasure of interviewing an executive from Google at a recent SAMA conference.
Yeah.
And these are his words, not our words. He said, AI will not be able to do the following things. Number one, you can't code trust. Number two, you can't code empathy.
Mm.
Number three, you can't code collaboration. And number four, you can't code discernment. And I love that because A, it's true, and B, I think it punctuates our discussion of why the human factors are going to matter more than ever.
Yeah.
Again, not my words, but his words. And I think it really puts a bow kind of on this need for vertical development.
Yeah. It's interesting that I had the pleasure of interviewing Rainer Stern, who's one of the heads of the global leadership development programs at SAP just yesterday. And in fact, he, alongside some others, are having a book published quite soon. And I was asking him to talk about, his perceptions of leadership in the world in which we're now living. And bearing in mind that he works for a big tech company, bearing in mind that there's been a lot in the press about SAP investing in artificial intelligence, bearing in mind that 8,000 people are being made redundant at SAP at the moment as part of their efficiency drives using AI technology. He said that the most important thing about leadership is relationships, the same as what you've just said. So it seems that it's very interesting that when you talk about relationships, and there are going to be people who said, well, actually, we all know that selling is about relationships. There's nothing new in what you're now saying. It's been How to Win Friends and Influence People, the wonderful book of Dale Carnegie, going back to those times. So yeah, relationships is important, but what's different now compared to then, do you think? I mean, perhaps you've alluded to it already in some of the the context of the other skills you need to have in a very fast-moving environment.
Well, I think a big part of it, Phil, is the future will be about what truth do you trust? Right now, we're facing political polarization in our country that we've never seen before. And a big part of it is the question of which truth do you trust? We're drowning in not just misinformation, but malinformation. And everybody's becoming confused. So I think it's not just a business issue, it's a societal issue. And that's why what Fred had talked about of character, and not only do I believe you, but do I trust you? Because I think this is going to be one of the salient issues of the future is which information do I trust? And that's why we believe the future is about being a trusted strategist. Do I trust you? And are you influencing the strategy of my company? That's why, again, who you are matters more than what you do.
I think just to build on that, what we're seeing is that relationships have always been important. If you're going to be successful in sales, in account management, relationships have always been important. We believe they're going to become more important.
Yeah.
And what we've tried to unpack is what's the core of trust, empathy, And how does that manifest itself? We call themselves fluencies, these fluencies for the future. So that's almost the capabilities that organizations, people will build that are grounded on that cognitive thinking mindsets and character habits. So relationships will always be important.
Yeah. Of course, I'm going to come back to fluencies in a short while, but of course, I can't help but sort of connect what you've been talking about just now to my own doctorate research, which started to look at this whole area of values and the role that they play in making customers want to work with certain, types of salespeople. And I go back to those days when I tried to get my dissertation published. I think you may remember this. I can't remember if I talked about it, but I tried to get it published in the Summer magazine, first time round. This is really going back to 2010, right? And I remember the conversation with the editor of the magazine at the time saying, why do you want to talk about values? We've been talking about value-based selling all along. And of course, he was listening to the word value, not the word values. And of course, the two words are so different. And I realized then the enormity that I faced at the time in trying to change the conversation around from competence and all of these other things that we've traditionally been addressed to one of the strands of your deeper sort of vertical that you've described around values. So what pleases me greatly about your research is the fact that you are building upon, this acknowledgement that the capabilities, you call it capacity, I think that's a great word, the capacity for great salespeople for the future. Yes, we need all those competencies along the horizontal, but the capacity is really going to be built by getting people to think about their cognitive ability, reflective practice, and how important, the character traits are and the values and mindsets. It just gives me so much pleasure hearing you talk about these things.
Well, Phil, I want to remind you of something you said at least 10, maybe more years ago. Your values are your value. That's your words, not mine.
Yeah.
That statement has never made more sense than right now. You were way ahead of the time. I think you were scratching on surfaces before their time. And so I think you were ahead of the game. But nothing has ever made more sense than that.
It's, I still find it quite interesting because when you start talking to, sort of to organizations about, what do they need to improve sales performance? They often talk about, well, we've got to change the mindset. So, okay, what do you mean by that? And it's quite often they don't really know what they mean by it. They just know it's to do with how you think, maybe. And I still feel, I find it still quite a journey to decodify, what that word means, because we've got fixed mindset. We've got the great work of Carol Dweck and the fixed and growth mindset. That's one reference to the word mindsets. We've got the mindsets that we talk about, proactive creativity, tactful audacity. We talk about resilience. You talk about grit. In your dissertation. It's quite. I often come back to this word resilience. That we talked about in the work of Paul Stoltz. In resilience, and I think that the way I looked at resilience at the time, and it may be wrong in the way that I approach this from a research point of view, is that I felt that resilience was like a hygiene factor, in the sense you've got to have it if you're in sales, because so much of the world of sales is changing, and, there's bitter disappointments having worked on these projects and they don't come off or whatever. And on top of resilience, you had these values and mindsets that customers really look for. So it's interesting that you brought that into your doctorate. You reminded me, of the work of Paul and what he had done, which is around the adversity quotient.
Well, and just so we're clear, where we landed on mindsets is building, Phil, on yours and Dr. Stoltz's. Let's be explicit. When we said mindset, it is number one, your core four: authenticity, client centricity, proactive creativity, and tactful audacity. And then we added the fifth from Dr. Paul Stoltz of grit, growth, resiliency, intensity, and tenacity. We believe that is the closest and most comprehensive definition that's kind of roughly right when it comes to mind.
Yeah. But the words of compassion and the words of Fred are so interesting, because you don't often hear that in the linguistics around sales, do you? And sales performance.
And that's, I think, the fun of this conversation is let's begin to develop a new moral vocabulary for sales, because it's a huge part of where we're going in the future. We need new words to describe the new muscles that we need to build here for the future.
Yeah. It's really interesting, because I can see compassion from a leadership point of view, but compassion from a sales, I can see that in the health sector. It's like, that's massively important. But I'm just thinking about compassion. I think you're right. I think you do. The person that you're selling to has a context. They have stuff going on in their lives, don't they? They have challenges that they're facing, and that ability to, focus in and be emotionally intelligent enough to be able to kind of read signals, and then react in an appropriate way. I guess that's what we're talking about when we talk about compassion.
And part of it, Phil, is also the emotional maturity in professional selling to not make the world about you. Until you understand life is not about you, it'll never make sense. And to truly be compassionate, you've got to get outside of yourself and really step into that other person. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, because by nature, we all tend to be very narcissistic. So that's part of that therapeutic aspect that we're talking about here. That it's not soft at all.
The other interesting thing about compassion, and this is Dr. Fred Kiel describing it, is we speak a lot about empathy, and compassion is the next level. So compassion is empathy in action. So you're actually taking empathy, you're understanding how other people think and feel, but you're actually doing something about it. So that's an interesting way to look at compassion.
So many different things are sort of coming together in this conversation, and about, I don't know if you ever did this as part of your research, the work of Jean McNiff and action research, and she talked about not values but lived values. And we're talking about character habits. It's character that it lives through habits. So there's one thing talking about recognizing the importance of something, like you say, with compassion. It's another thing doing something as a consequence of it, which is the action part of empathy, the compassion.
It's also part of the journey that James referenced of this landscape of literature that we got exposed to that we never would have. And to be quite honest, much of it was not actionable. I don't mean that critically. I just mean it accurately, that, what matters is how does this thinking actually turn into action? Really, I think, James, what you and I found is, of all the literature that we saw, I would say roughly 10 to maybe 15% of it was truly actionable. And a lot of it, I call pushing the clouds around. I don't mean it critically, but that's not helpful now. In today's world, is we don't need to put more complexity in people. We need to give them some actionability.
This is a bit of a sort of curveball comment, and this is about time. And as we've been talking about actionable habits, I was recounting a story that David Goleman of the emotional intelligence, behind the emotional intelligence, described of this study that he did of people attending a theology class, and it was about the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this exercise where each one of them had to go and deliver a practice sermon at a different faculty building. So they've been attending this sort of workshop around the Good Samaritan, and they deliberately staged someone in distress on the pathway that linked the two buildings together. And so it's quite interesting to see how many people had been in this theology class about the Good Samaritan would actually stop and look after and take care of this person, knowing that they had an important sermon to give, in a predefined time. And he had this notion that the majority of students actually didn't stop, didn't give the compassion, even though they were theology students. Yeah. And it said it wasn't that they didn't want to help, but we have this world in which we live, which is so time, we're so time deprived that having the strength of character, I guess, to action, compassion, sometimes is difficult because we simply don't have the time, to give compassion, rushing from one meeting to the next. You don't have time to actually act some of these important values. So I suppose my curveball in all of this, sales is a very time scarce environment. There's a huge challenge, I think, sometimes to live all of these values in the right way. I suppose that's a question mark for you.
No,
That's
it's
a bit
not.
of
I think it's a refreshing kind of summation of Fred's work, in essence, saying we're not human doings, we're human beings. And ultimately, your impact in life and business isn't going to be the accumulation of activity. It's the way in which you've showed up to others and how others experience you. And Phil, to your point, it's not what you think, it's what you do. Back to that analogy you just gave.
Yeah.
Is a beautiful story that illuminates. We can think a lot of things, but what do we actually do?
Yeah.
Actually
It's so true, but I suppose I'm reflecting a bit on myself here, because there's certain situations that I'm in where I know I could do a better job. I know that I could do better. I know that I could be more client-centric. I know that if I had more time, I could probably come up with more creative ideas for clients. And I catch myself, thinking, gosh, I wish I could do more. I suppose that may be a self-improved pressure, but I mean, I think we do a lot of the right things, having said all that. But I know that there are times when it's sometimes pretty darn difficult, to implement things as we would like all the time.
But you said the key word, you're catching yourself, because by nature, as human beings, we're all flawed, we're all self-centric.
Yeah.
But you just said the key word. I think the fun part about learning is to catch yourself.
To catch yourself doing
we're
it.
all going to make mistakes, but
I
if
know.
you catch more, that's a beautiful day.
Yes.
And
Okay.
to just reflect in action, which is exactly what you just did. We don't always do that. We don't have the time to reflect. So thanks. That was a great
It's
example.
hard. It needs practice. It needs cultivation. It needs focus, doesn't it? It needs pushing the boundaries. It's quite interesting that when we talk about things like proactive creativity or tactful audacity, we say, well, where are you going to set the bar on this? What does good look like when it comes to being proactively creative? And we've done the same with simple concepts like being client-centric, no brainer. How can we, stretch what we're doing? And I think I think that to me is interesting. I had a great mentor, dear Peter Critton, who sadly has passed away as well, who talked about where you get the information. It's what, the boundaries, it's what happens right at the boundary edge where you're pushing things to the limit that you often get that aha moment, that sort of inspiration, that new idea. And I think that's what's so interesting about the academic thought process, but also in a practical sense, from a sales point of view, I think that's what clients are looking for. Salespeople, selling organizations, selling to them who have this extra something, this intellectual acumen, if you like, wrapped up with all the other things you've described that's important.
And Phil, maybe as we close on this mindset discussion, I'll just add one framing thought, which is to trade in the need to be right for the desire to be curious.
Mm,
And I've just found that to be not just in business, but a life-changing trade-up.
yeah.
The moment you quit needing to be right, everything opens up. It's just so much more fun to get out of bed.
Yeah.
And I believe the future of selling is to live a life of permanent curiosity, to just be structurally, radically, and authentically curious about the human being that's in front of you. What a delightful way to spend a life and a vocation, isn't it? And I think when you do that, the other things we've just talked about fall in place.
All in place. So interesting. So can we talk about fluencies? Can we talk about, the outputs of your amazing piece of work and what you consider to be the key fluencies for the sales organizations of the future?
James, do you want me to summarize them, and then you can jump on the ones you would like to illuminate, and let's have some fun. These are in no order, and they will change over time. But as we looked at the medium-term future, kind of what we saw is some distinguishing fluencies. I think that's the moniker that we'll put on this next piece of the dialogue. Number one is one that we call professional noticing. We'll come back to that. I'll give you the list first, and then we'll come back. Number one, professional noticing. Number two, something we call signal sensing. And a signal is an indicator of a future event that hasn't occurred yet. Number three is design thinking. Back to this notion of it's not just the depth of your thinking, it's also the structure of your thinking. The fourth one is the one that defines our firm as third box thinking. Thinking about customer's customer. Number five is integral perspective, the ability to see things whole, to see the context of things, back to this therapeutic mindset. And finally, is this ability to lead value networks and this collaboration ability that James has mentioned. So that's kind of the laundry list we came up with. And James, I'll toss it over to you to pick a few to kind of expand on as you choose.
Yeah, I think just to mention that the sales profession we see is on a journey. We don't have all the answers by any means. So in itself, I think the evolution of professional selling is going to be a highly collaborative effort. So a little bit what we're talking about here is an invitation to thought leaders, people in industry to join the conversation and say, what are going to be these fluencies of the future, and how do you build and develop those in people? If you look at adult development theory, the work of Keegan, it takes time. So one of the questions in our mind is, how can you accelerate that? What are some of the things that organizations can do, people can do to invest in building that capacity? I think we're quite good at the capability dimension, as we were saying earlier, but we really haven't explored the capacity dimension. And we believe they manifest themselves in these fluencies. The one I'm really passionate about is about how do you collaborate as a network to co-create a future outcome that isn't something that's solved or resolved at the moment. So it's in the unknown space. Nobody really has the answer. How do organizations, people come together and figure that out? And it's going to take ecosystems or networks of people and companies to do that. And then how do you do that? I think that's a lot of the work we've been doing actually over some years. Phil, if I think about our work in co-creation going back to the early 2000s with Cisco, and when they were setting up their global enterprise theater, to how it's evolving today. And
I think the two that I'm uniquely intrigued by is, first one is professional noticing. And I think it has two arms to it. Number one, the ability to listen without solving. which sounds really simple, but it's very difficult.
Mm.
This ability to not solve too quickly. Neurologically, it has been proven that once we start to solve, we quit listening. It's impossible to solve and listen. The second vector of professional noticing is the ability to listen for what a customer is not saying. Because what we're looking for is, what don't they know that they don't know? As part of tactful audacity is to bring them an insight that maybe they're not even aware of.
Mm.
So that's why I think this is just going to be one of the new fun mental muscles to build on, is this whole area of listening and noticing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the other one gets back to my original discussion of the shift from persuasion to alignment, which is third box thinking. And it's what our companies build on, as you well know, Phil, which is starting with your customer's customer and thinking backwards to yourself. Nothing mystical, but fundamentally it's the architecture of alignment. And it's common sense, but it's just not common. And it's ironic that we've literally built a company on the world's most simple model. Those are the two that animate me the most right now. Phil, is there any other you would add to the list? Let's have fun for a minute. Anything else for the moderate term list here?
No, I just love this idea of, of noticing. So what was the two words you connected together?
Listen without scolding and listen for what they're not saying.
Yeah. And what I really love collecting examples on, or how a simple word can change a conversation so dramatically. And it's not the word itself. For example, let's go on the fun bus together. Yeah, let's just take that as a word. Now, would you have put that in your top 10 closing technique phrases? Maybe not. Yeah, maybe you wouldn't. But I've seen how that phrase has completely transformed a strategic relationship and generated literally millions of pounds worth of business. Yeah. Another word could be, oh, there's something I think you might not have thought of. Just a simple word. Yeah, but of course, behind that has got to come a lot of thinking, a lot of research, a lot of reading the tea leaves, and I think that the thought process expressed in simple language, which is then used to grow conversation, I think that's a real skill. And it's fun. It's fun because it takes you to places that you wouldn't perhaps naturally think of going. But having the self-confidence to be able to, to play some of these perhaps slightly odd words at times, I think is the sign of someone who is really in tune actually with what's going around and can pick the words that will open up, because they're in tune, they're listening out for these signs, they're asking the question that will generate a new line of thinking. That's what I think is brilliant about selling. And it's lovely to collect these examples, from stuff, stuff that happens with our clients and stuff that we do ourselves. Yeah. We were, for example,
I think you hit on a key thing. Building your personal vocabulary deeply matters. Thomas Jefferson said it's important to have new words to articulate new ideas. Winston Churchill at the beginning of World War II said, I knew Hitler had more weapons, so I knew I had to use words as weapons, and it worked. If Martin Luther King would have said, I had a plan, instead of I have a dream, we wouldn't be talking about him today.
Yeah.
Words matter deeply. Build your vocabulary.
Yeah.
Not to impress people, but to express to people. Let's be clear.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how these simple things can trigger something sort of like you say, you've chosen much better, much grander examples than I've used. But it's it's
It's also
interesting.
how you use the words, Phil.
Yeah,
David
it
Brooks
is.
has a new book out called How to Know Another Person. It's a beautiful body of work. And in there, he describes two archetypes of human beings in a room. First are the illuminators. These are people that are asking you about you. Secondly, are the diminishers. The diminishers are talking about themselves. And so it's not just words, but it's also, again, back to what Fred has talked about of how you show up to others. Are you trying to be interested or interesting? And I think so this builds into this whole development of depth and self
Yeah.
and the whole conversation we're having. I think
Yes.
fun.
It was interesting. We were involved in a major pitch before Christmas, and which we eventually won. I don't think I've shared this news with you, but I'll talk about it to you some other stage. But we had quite a bit of a confrontational, sort of presentation, I suppose. We're being challenged on our approach, and we were asked then a question at the end of it. He said, "Is there anything you think that we should have considered that we haven't yet considered for this sales transformation project?" And I said, "I don't think that you have the capacity to handle a transformation of this type." Yeah. I question whether you do. Yeah, I just question it. I don't know, but I'm just questioning it, which is genuine. It was a genuine kind of response. And I remember a sharp intake of breath from one of my colleagues and a kick under the table saying, Philip, what on earth are you doing? But actually, it's I don't know how that relates back to the fluencies that you spoke about, or the but I think it's that sense. I think you triggered me saying this because of your word about sort of sensing, knowing when is the right time, when can you be slightly tactfully audacious. Maybe that wasn't so tactful, maybe it was more on the audacious side. But I think it was a genuine question on our part, which is people underestimate how much it takes to transform. We talked about it earlier. Are you trying to build a faster caterpillar and you're just trying to improve performance? Or are you truly trying to transform? I don't think many people get this notion of transformation because they're not yet equipped with the skills that you described in that vertical that you talked about earlier about the fluencies. They don't understand what it takes to actually get that shift. We've come back to the eras we've talked about earlier, to get that shift in what's needed in today's world in selling. You need to go deep, I think, to really get it. And I'm not sure that people necessarily get it. And then it begs the question, do we want to work with people who don't get it?
I think the story you just told, Phil, I would describe that as an example of authentic compassion, which is sharing not just what people want to hear, but what they need to hear. But also you had the discernment. I think the key word is discernment to know that it was appropriate in that moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's that's a kind of confluence of a lot of the factors we've just been talking about.
I think it is. And and we don't get it right all the time, of course. And there is risk involved, isn't it? But I think this is what's fabulous about the world in which we live. It's quite a complex world. It's about people, it's about relationships, like you were saying earlier on. And it's trying to get it right. I think that's what we're striving for. Yeah.
And part of what James and I talk about in our work is, especially in sales, back to developing self, is it's critically important who you surround yourself with. Surround yourself with people who make you better, number one. But secondly, people that will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. True friends.
Yeah.
And so part of this is why I go back to my obsession with relationships. It's not a soft thing at all. It's no longer an option in this
Yeah.
crazy world right now.
Yeah.
Relationships are my oxygen.
Yeah.
I don't just want relationships. I need them.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's not just about the relationship. I mean, relationship is really important, but it's the other things you've described also important. It's that level of intellectual acumen, I call it. You sort of wrapped it up, because you can have trust and you can have compassion, but you don't have that edge, that sort of, I don't know, that creative streak that sort of gets innovation going. So you need to have all of these things. You can't have the innovation without the compassion. You've got to have them all. If we're going to have a well-balanced, a well-nuanced approach to sales.
Yeah.
And Phil, you asked a provocative question. Do you want to work with clients who don't get it? James and I, our counsel is we tell our clients, look at your clients maybe in 3 buckets. Number 1, there are transformational customers that will make you better by doing business with them. They'll bring you a higher level of insight, like playing tennis with a better player, it ups your game.
Yeah.
The second persona are transitionals. These are customers that are looking for direction and are seeking your counsel. And then the third are transactionals. They don't want higher order insights. It's purely about price and transaction. And by the way, it's not right or wrong. It's just having the discernment to know which flavor you're working with, and then adjust your own dosage. James, you spent a lot of time on that. Anything to add to that kind of 3 bucket persona?
Yeah, I think you have to recognize where clients are right now, and where the customer is. And so often we have the idea that where we would like clients or people to be, but it's discernment as to where they are, and engaging them where they are, and then going on a journey together to say, how do we evolve and get better?
Yeah. Well, I'm very conscious of time, and we've been on this podcast, I think, for a certain length of time, quite long. I'm sure it's going to be chunked up. If I don't know what Eddie is, if Eddie's still listening into this, he probably is. He's switched off his camera. But I think we've reached the end of what's been a remarkable conversation. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic to talk to you about your piece of work.
And Phil, I'd end on what James started with. Thank you for bringing us together for this reunion. Thank you for giving us language for what was inside of James and I way back when. Thank you for being a friend and a partner for years. And because what we want to do is build on what you built. And I hope we have done that. If we've done that, then I think we can sleep well.
You definitely have done it. You've taken it on to another sort of level. So I'm very grateful for the work you've done. But no, I think we've learned a huge amount from you. The simplicity of your thought frameworks, the 3rd box framework that is so important to you. It's something, as you know, we refer to a huge amount as well with our clients. So no, it's been a fantastic opportunity to get back together. It's not often you get 3 people on a call, with doctorates in sales, is it?
This is
it's probably the only time it's happened.
I think it is. I think